stop what you're doing. Close the other tabs. Put down whatever else you are reading. Because what is about to be described in the next several minutes of your attention involves something that Microsoft has been infrastructure of every Windows 11 machine currently running on the planet. Something that is scheduled to arrive on your computer, whether you want it or not, whether you consent to it or not, and whether you're even aware it is coming or not. In a forced deployment wave whose scope and technical implications have not received anywhere near the coverage they deserve, given what the update actually does to the machine you use every single day to manage your work, your finances, your communications, and every other dimension of your digital life that depends on your computer behaving the way you expect it to behave, rather than the way Microsoft has decided it should behave after this update reaches you. Microsoft is forcing Copilot onto every Windows PC in May, not offering it, not recommending it, not presenting it as an optional enhancement you can evaluate and install on your own timeline after reading what it does and deciding whether you want it. Forcing it. Through the Windows Update infrastructure that your machine checks automatically, trusts implicitly, and installs from without presenting you a meaningful opportunity to review what is being installed before it arrives. Through a deployment mechanism that Microsoft has used before to push features onto Windows machines without the explicit user authorization that the scope and implications of those features would require if Microsoft presented them honestly as what they are, which is a fundamental restructuring of how your operating system operates, what data it collects about your behavior, and what it does with that data after it has collected it. The update is real. The deployment timeline is documented in Microsoft's own Insider Preview release notes and in the enterprise IT administrator communications that Microsoft distributes to organizations whose Windows deployments they are warning about upcoming changes, so those organizations can prepare. The general consumer population has received no equivalent communication because Microsoft's deployment strategy for Copilot's forced integration has been to minimize advance notice to ordinary users whose machines will be affected, while providing technical documentation to enterprise administrators whose organizations have the infrastructure to push back against unwanted deployments. The distinction between how Microsoft is communicating this update to enterprise customers and how it is not communicating it to ordinary consumers is itself something you should find alarming before you have even processed what the update does to your machine. When a company treats its individual consumer customers differently from its enterprise customers in terms of advance notice for a significant system change, the difference in treatment reflects a calculation that enterprise customers have both the technical capacity to detect the change and the contractual leverage to object to it, while individual consumers have neither. Microsoft's differential communication about the forced Copilot update is a deliberate strategy built on the accurate assessment that most Windows users will not know it is coming until it has already arrived, will not understand what arrived when it does, and will not know how to undo what it does even if they want to. That calculation is what this piece exists to disrupt. Here is what Copilot actually is at the technical level that Microsoft's marketing materials do not explain, because understanding what is being forced onto your machine requires understanding what the thing being forced actually does, rather than what Microsoft's promotional language describes it as doing. Microsoft Copilot is not a search assistant. It is not a helpful chatbot that answers questions about your documents when you feel like asking it something. It is not a passive tool that sits dormant until you deliberately invoke it and then returns to dormancy when you close it. Those characterizations describe how Microsoft's public communications about Copilot position the feature for marketing purposes. The technical reality of what Copilot does when it is installed and running on your machine is substantially different from those characterizations in ways that matter enormously for your privacy, your system performance, your data security, and your understanding of what your computer is doing with your information. At every moment it is running. Copilot in its forced May deployment configuration operates as a persistent system-level process that maintains continuous awareness of your computing activity. Not awareness in the sense of a background service that notes which applications you have open. Awareness in the sense of an active behavioral monitoring architecture that observes what you are working on, what content appears in your active application windows, what you type, what you search, what files you open, what you copy to your clipboard, what websites you visit, and how the patterns of your daily computing behavior evolve over time into the behavioral profile that feeds the AI inference engine at Copilot's core. The behavioral monitoring architecture is not incidental to Copilot's function, it is Copilot's function. The AI assistant capability that Microsoft promotes as Copilot's value proposition is the consumer-facing output of an underlying system whose primary purpose is behavioral data collection, behavioral modeling, and behavioral prediction applied to your personal computing activity in the service of the commercial AI and advertising infrastructure that represents Microsoft's actual business rationale for deploying Copilot aggressively enough to force it onto machines whose users have not requested it. A feature you want and ask for does not get forced onto your machine through automatic update infrastructure. A feature that needs to reach every possible Windows machine because its value to Microsoft is proportional to the number of machines running it, gets forced onto every Windows machine through automatic update infrastructure. The forcing is the evidence of what Copilot actually is underneath its marketing. Presentation. Because Microsoft does not force things onto hundreds of millions of machines because those things benefit the machine's users. Microsoft forces things onto hundreds of millions of machines because those things benefit Microsoft, and the user's machines are the infrastructure through which the benefit is extracted. The specific technical changes that the forced Copilot update makes to your system go far beyond installing a new application into your programs list. The installation is the visible surface of a much deeper system modification, whose components are distributed across your operating system's core architecture in ways that make them difficult to identify, difficult to isolate, and deliberately resistant to simple uninstallation through the add or remove programs mechanism that Windows provides for ordinary software. The update installs Copilot's persistent background service, which runs continuously from system startup, regardless of whether you ever open the Copilot interface or consciously use any Copilot functionality. The service maintains the behavioral monitoring pipeline that observes your computing activity and feeds the data collection infrastructure, whose output is transmitted to Microsoft's cloud systems on the transmission schedule that Windows 11's data pipeline operates on. The service is registered in Windows' service infrastructure in a way that marks it as a system-critical component, which means that Windows' normal service management behavior protects it from user-initiated stopping and treats attempts to disable it as potentially problematic system modifications rather than normal user preference adjustments. The update also installs what Microsoft's technical documentation refers to as Copilot's context understanding components, which are the system hooks that give the behavioral monitoring pipeline its visibility into the content of your active application windows, your clipboard, your file system activity, and your browser behavior. These hooks operate at a level of system integration that sits below ordinary application access, meaning that the content awareness Copilot achieves through these hooks is not constrained by the application-level permission frameworks that govern what ordinary applications can see and access on your machine. The context hooks see across application boundaries in ways that individual applications cannot see each other, providing Copilot's monitoring architecture with a unified view of your computing activity that no individual application has, and that the operating system itself historically maintained but did not exploit for behavioral data collection purposes. The network transmission component of the forced installation creates a dedicated data transmission channel between your machine and Microsoft's Copilot cloud infrastructure that operates independently of your ordinary internet traffic, and that is not subject to the network traffic inspection that enterprise security tools apply to ordinary application traffic. The independent transmission channel is a deliberate architectural choice that ensures Copilot's data transmission continues even in network environments where traffic inspection or content filtering policies might otherwise intercept it, and that ensures the data transmission volume and frequency that Copilot's behavioral monitoring generates does not create detectable anomalies in your network traffic patterns that might alert security-conscious users to the scope of what is being transmitted. The performance implications of a persistent system-level behavioral monitoring process running continuously on your machine are not theoretical, and they are not negligible. Security researchers and enterprise IT administrators who analyze the Copilot integration in Windows Insider Preview builds before the general deployment documented consistent and measurable impacts on system performance across the hardware configurations that represent the majority of the currently operating Windows PC population. On machines with 8 GB of RAM, which represents a substantial portion of currently deployed Windows PCs, given that 8 GB was the standard configuration for consumer machines sold across a wide period of the Windows 10. And early Windows 11 era, the Copilot Persistent Services memory footprint in active behavioral monitoring mode consumed enough of the available RAM to produce measurable application loading delays, increased page file usage indicating memory pressure that the system is compensating for by using disk storage as overflow memory and reduced responsiveness in memory. Intensive tasks, including browser operation with multiple tabs, document editing, and video playback. The degradation was not catastrophic on 8 GB machines. It was consistent, measurable, and present in every test configuration, meaning that the machines whose users are most dependent on every available bit of performance because they cannot afford newer hardware are the machines that will experience the most impact from the forced installation's resource consumption. On older processors, the continuous behavioral analysis operations that Copilot's context understanding components perform represent a persistent CPU load whose background presence reduces the processing headroom available for the applications you're actually trying to use. Video calls become choppier. Application switching becomes slower. File operations that were previously instantaneous develop a perceptible lag. None of these individual degradations are dramatic enough to be immediately recognized as the result of a new system process. They are collectively perceptible as a general sluggishness whose cause most users will not identify as the forced installation that preceded its onset. Microsoft's internal performance testing for the forced Copilot deployment was conducted on the current generation hardware configurations that Microsoft's product teams use for development and testing, which are substantially more powerful than the machines representing the middle of the currently deployed Windows PC population. The performance data from that testing was used to characterize the forced installation as having minimal performance impact, a characterization that is accurate for the hardware configurations used in testing and inaccurate for the hardware configurations representing the majority of machines that the forced deployment will actually reach. The data privacy implications of the forced Copilot installation are the dimension of this deployment that regulatory investigators in Europe have been examining with the specific urgency that the scope of what Copilot's behavioral monitoring collects demands. The German Federal Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information formally requested technical documentation from Microsoft about the Copilot forced deployment's data collection architecture within days of receiving the insider preview analysis that security researchers submitted, citing the continuous behavioral monitoring component as raising concerns under GDPR's Article 5 requirements for data minimization and purpose limitation that the scope of what Copilot observes appears to substantially exceed. The Article 5 concern is specific. GDPR's data minimization principle requires that personal data collected about individuals be limited to what is necessary for the specific purpose for which it is collected. The behavioral monitoring architecture that Copilot's forced installation deploys on your machine collects a far broader range of behavioral data than providing you with an AI assistant requires. It observes your application usage patterns in detail that assistant functionality does not require. It monitors your file access behavior beyond what responding to your file-related questions demands. It maintains continuous clipboard awareness that persists through copy operations that have nothing to do with any Copilot interaction you have initiated. The collection scope exceeds assistant functionality by margins that data protection authorities are characterizing as evidence that the assistant functionality is not the actual purpose for which the collection is designed, which raises the fundamental question of what the actual purpose is and whether that purpose would receive user consent if disclosed directly. The UK Information Commissioner's Office added the forced Copilot deployment to its active technical audit of Windows 11's data practices with specific note that the forced nature of the deployment means that no meaningful consent mechanism exists for the behavioral monitoring architecture that the deployment installs. GDPR's consent framework requires that consent for personal data processing be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. Consent obtained by installing a behavioral monitoring system on a user's machine through an automatic update that the user cannot meaningfully decline is not freely given. Consent implied by a user's continued use of their operating system after a forced installation is not specific, informed, or unambiguous in the ways that GDPR requires. For the sensitive categories of behavioral data that Copilot's monitoring architecture collects, the enterprise compliance emergency generated by the forced Copilot deployment announcement has been by the measurement of how fast enterprise IT organizations mobilized to develop blocking procedures among the fastest organizational responses to a Microsoft deployment decision in recent memory. Enterprise information security frameworks are built around the principle that data leaves the organizational security perimeter only through explicitly authorized channels and only through processes that the organization's security policies have specifically evaluated and approved. A system-level behavioral monitoring process that transmits behavioral data about employee computing activity to Microsoft's cloud infrastructure through a dedicated transmission channel that bypasses normal traffic inspection is not an authorized data transmission channel. It is an undeclared data exfiltration vector from the perspective of enterprise security frameworks, regardless of whether Microsoft's characterization of it as a productivity feature is sincerely intended. Healthcare organizations whose employees use Windows machines are facing the most acute compliance emergency from the forced Copilot deployment because Copilot's behavioral monitoring architecture will observe and potentially transmit everything those employees work with during their computing sessions, including patient records, clinical documentation, medication information, and health data, whose protection HIPAA requires be maintained within controlled infrastructure with specific access logging and breach notification obligations. The continuous content awareness that Copilot's context hooks provide means that the AI monitoring system will have visibility into patient data that healthcare organizations have spent enormous effort and resources ensuring remains within their controlled security perimeter. And the forced deployment mechanism means that maintaining that perimeter requires actively blocking an update from the operating system vendor, rather than simply prohibiting employees from installing unauthorized applications. The blocking procedure that prevents the forced Copilot deployment from reaching your machine requires action before the May update wave reaches your system, because the blocking mechanisms that work at the pre-installation stage are substantially simpler and more reliable than the removal procedures that become necessary after the installation has completed. Microsoft's installation architecture for system-integrated components like Copilot is designed to make pre-installation blocking straightforward only through the mechanisms Microsoft has provided for enterprise management, while making post-installation removal difficult through the intentional integration depth that characterizes system-critical component installations. Block it before it arrives, because undoing it after it arrives is a substantially more difficult task that requires more technical sophistication, and that may not fully reverse every component the installation deploys. On Windows 11 Pro and Enterprise machines with Group Policy Editor available, the most durable blocking mechanism operates at the policy level that persists through subsequent update cycles and resists the update deployment mechanisms that would restore user-facing settings to Microsoft's preferred defaults. Open Group Policy Editor by pressing the Windows key and R simultaneously, typing gpedit, MSC in the Run dialog that appears, and pressing Enter. Navigate through the left panel hierarchy to Computer Configuration, then Administrative Templates, then Windows Components, and look for the Windows Copilot policy folder that appears in machines that have received the Insider Preview policy templates. Within the Windows Copilot policy folder, find the policy setting labeled Turn Off Windows Copilot and set it to Enabled. An enabled state for a turn-off policy means the feature is turned off, which is the naming convention group policy uses that requires conscious attention to avoid accidentally setting a policy in the wrong direction. After setting the group policy Copilot Disable, navigate additionally to Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates, System, and find the policy settings governing Windows Update Behavior. Find the policy labeled Do Not Include Drivers with Windows Updates and review whether it is currently configured, as Copilot system hook components are delivered through driver-level packages in some deployment configurations, and blocking driver updates through this policy prevents those components from reaching your machine through the driver update pathway, even if the standard update blocking is working for the application-level components. Set this policy to Enabled for Windows 11 home users. Without Group Policy Editor access, the registry-level blocking that provides equivalent protection requires creating and setting specific values that the update deployment mechanism checks before installing Copilot components. Open Registry Editor by pressing the Windows key and R, typing regedit, pressing Enter, and confirming the user account control prompt that appears. Navigate to HKEE Local Machine, Software Policies, Microsoft, Windows, Windows Copilot. If the Windows Copilot key does not exist under the Windows key in that path, create it by right-clicking the Windows key, selecting New, then Key, and naming the new key Windows Copilot exactly with matching capitalization. Inside the Windows Copilot key, create a new DORD 32-bit value by right-clicking in the right panel, selecting New, then DORD 32-bit value, and naming the value Turn Off Windows Copilot. Set the value's data to 1. Navigate additionally to HKEI Current User, Software, Policies, Microsoft, Windows, Windows Copilot, and create an identical turn-off Windows Copilot DWORD value set to 1 in this user-level policy location. Setting the block at both the machine level and the user level in registry ensures that the deployment check encounters the disable flag regardless of whether it checks machine-level policies, user-level policies, or both. After creating the registry values, navigate to HKEI Local Machine, Software, Microsoft, Windows, Current Version, Policies, Data Collection. Find or create a DWORD value named Allow Telemetry and examine its current setting. A value of 0 disables telemetry transmission. A value of 1 sets basic telemetry. And higher values enable enhanced and full telemetry collection. Setting Allow Telemetry to 0 on Enterprise builds or 1 on Pro builds restricts the telemetry pipeline that Copilot's behavioral monitoring would use to transmit collected data, providing an additional layer of protection that operates on the data transmission side, rather than only on the installation side, for the Windows Update blocking that prevents the Copilot update package from arriving through the automatic update mechanism. Before your registry and group policy blocks are in place, open Windows Settings by pressing Windows key and I, navigate to Windows Update, select Advanced Options, and find the Pause Updates section. Pause updates for the maximum available duration, which is currently 5 weeks in Windows 11's Update Pause interface. The pause provides a buffer window during which you can complete the registry and group policy blocking procedures before updates resume. Updates paused through this mechanism will be delivered when the pause expires, but by that point, your group policy and registry blocks will be in place to intercept the Copilot components when they arrive. For users with Windows 11 Pro or Enterprise who use the Windows Update for Business configuration available in Group Policy, navigate to Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Windows Update for Business, and configure the select when preview builds and feature updates are received policy to defer feature updates by the maximum deferral period of 365 days. Feature update deferral prevents new Windows feature deployments from reaching your machine for the full deferral period, providing a year-long buffer during which Microsoft's forced Copilot deployment will be blocked while your machine continues receiving security patches through the expedited security update pathway that Windows Update for Business separates from feature updates. For the network-level blocking that prevents Copilot's data transmission from reaching Microsoft's cloud infrastructure even if installation components somehow arrive before your blocking measures intercept them, your router's DNS filtering or hosts file modification can be used to block the specific Microsoft endpoints that Copilot's transmission architecture uses. The primary Copilot telemetry endpoints whose blocking disrupts the behavioral data transmission pipeline include Copilot, Microsoft, Com, Sydney, Bing, Com, and the broader set of Microsoft telemetry collection endpoints documented by privacy researchers that include settings, Win, data, Microsoft, Com and v10, events, data, Microsoft, Com, adding these endpoints to a host's file block or DNS filter blocks. Copilot's cloud communication at the network level independently of whether the installation itself was successfully prevented. After completing the blocking procedures, the verification process that confirms your machine is protected before the May update wave arrives requires testing several distinct layers of the protection you have put in place. For group policy verification, open Group Policy Editor and navigate back to the Windows Copilot policy folder. Confirm that the Turn Off Windows Copilot policy shows as enabled in the policy state column. Then open a command prompt as administrator by right-clicking the Start button and selecting Terminal Administrator or Command Prompt Administrator, and run the command gresult-r to generate a group policy results report that shows which policies are currently applied to your machine. Find the Windows Copilot policy in the output and confirm it appears in the Applied Policies section rather than the Not Applied section, which would indicate that the policy path was created correctly, but the policy setting is not being applied to the active machine configuration. For registry verification, reopen Registry Editor and navigate back to both the machine level and user level Windows Copilot registry paths you created. Confirm that the Turn Off Windows Copilot values exist at both paths and that both show a value of 1 rather than 0. A value of 0 at either location means the setting is in the wrong state and the blocking will not function as intended. For update blocking verification, navigate to Windows Update and Settings and check the update history to see whether any Copilot-related packages appear in recently installed updates. If the update history shows Copilot-related packages as successfully installed before you completed the blocking procedures, the forced installation has already reached your machine, and the removal procedure rather than the blocking procedure is what your situation requires. If the update history shows no Copilot packages and your blocking measures are confirmed active through the group policy and registry verification, your machine is protected against the forced deployment. The significance of acting before May is not that Copilot becomes unblockable after the deployment wave reaches your machine. It is that each day between now and May during which your machine is running without blocking measures is a day during which your machine is operating in the pre-deployment window, where simple policy blocking prevents arrival, rather than in the post-deployment condition where the installation's deep system. Integration requires the more technically demanding removal procedures that work against a component that Windows' own architecture has been configured to protect and preserve. What Microsoft is forcing onto your machine in May is not a helpful assistant that quietly improves your productivity and asks nothing in return. It is a behavioral monitoring architecture whose commercial purpose is extracting the AI training and behavioral intelligence value from your personal computing activity without your specific awareness, and without the explicit consent that awareness would allow you to give or withhold. The forced deployment mechanism is the evidence that Microsoft knows this characterization is more accurate than the productivity tool framing, because productivity tools do not need to be forced onto machines whose users have not requested them. Your computer is your property. The data your computing behavior generates is your data, the behavioral intelligence. Microsoft's Copilot architecture extracts from your computing activity is intelligence whose commercial value belongs to you and that Microsoft intends to extract through a system it is installing on your machine without your meaningful consent. The blocking procedures are above. The verification steps confirm they are working. The deadline is May, and it is not manufactured, and it is not distant. Your machine is running right now, building the behavioral profile that Copilot's forced installation will begin transmitting to Microsoft the moment the May update wave reaches a machine that has not been protected. Protect yours before the update reaches it, because the update does not ask permission. And after May, it will not need to. The procedures are above. The deadline is real. Block it now.